How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 24th video on my channel, and today we're going to begin our third book, Prolegomena to a Theory of Language by Louis Hjelmslev. I'm quite excited for this book, since it will be very helpful for understanding Felix Guattari's semiotics and the capitalism and schizophrenia duology. Getting right into it, these first two videos won't contain all that much on Hjelmslev's linguistics itself. Instead, he uses the first 11 or so chapters to basically just define what he's talking about in some quite abstract terms, which I hope I can clarify with this series. Today, we'll be looking at the first 8 chapters, starting with the study of language and the theory of language, followed by linguistic theory and humanism, empiricism, induction, and reality. Then, the aim of linguistic theory and perspectives of linguistic theory, ending finally, but not all leastly, on the system of definitions. Hjelmslev begins with what is essentially a love letter to language. For him, language is a limitless source of treasures and inseparable from us as human beings. As he tenderly puts it,
language is the ultimate indispensable sustainer of the human individual, his refuge in hours of loneliness when the mind wrestles with existence.
It's therefore no surprise that language has long been an object of study for scientists and poets, he says. However, to those people, language is almost exclusively a means to an end, rarely being considered an end in itself. To give an example, just look at psychologists or psychoanalysts like Jacques Lacan. For them, language only matters insofar as it can be used to understand the nature of thought. Nothing more, nothing less. Hjelmslev calls this approach transcendent. It seeks through language an object that lies outside of it. He puts this in contrast to what he calls an immanent approach, one that takes language itself as its end point of study. If one takes the transcendent viewpoint, Hjelmslev says,
the physical and physiological description of speech sounds easily degenerates into pure physics and pure physiology, so that the linguistic point of departure is lost from view.
It's for this reason that it's so important for linguistics to not overlook the immanent side of language. It's all well and good to study pure physics, pure psychology, and what have you. He isn't disparaging those approaches per se, but we need to be careful not to miss the vital tool that allows us to examine all those things in the first place. To do this, he says that we have to grasp language not as a massive conglomerate of different components, but rather as a self-sufficient totality in a class of its own.
Only in this way can language in itself be subjected to scientific treatment without again disappointing its investigators and escaping their view.
Ending the chapter, Hjelmslev moves on to say that such a theory of immanent linguistics requires the entire field to be started anew, with the past mostly being forgotten and its data reinterpreted. As a starting point for this endeavor, he singles out Ferdinand de Saussure, whose course in general linguistics we covered a while back, as his principal influence. With this, we get to Chapter 2, Linguistic Theory and Humanism, which Hjelmslev starts by saying that for linguistics to truly be immanent, it must first find some sort of constancy. In other words, what makes a language that's anchored in itself, rather than in some kind of external reality. In his eyes, this runs counter to what he terms the humanistic tradition in linguistics. According to this view, language exists purely as a social fact, one that occurs only in humans, and cannot be studied through generalization and exact treatment, like is done with natural phenomena. Instead,
in the field of humanities, consequently, there would have to be a different method, namely mere description, which would be nearer to poetry than to exact science.
Hjelmslev's goal with this book is essentially to break with this tradition, and to examine linguistics through the lens of systemization. On this, he says that a priori, that is based on theoretical deduction, we can assume the thesis that every process, like that of language, has a corresponding system in which those processes can be described using a certain number of premises. In turn, processes can be broken down into a specific amount of elements that can further be divided up into classes based on the order in which they occur. Through this process, Hjelmslev argues, we can create what he terms a general and exhaustive calculus, a method for accounting for every possible combination of elements. To him, as long as the humanities don't test this thesis, they fail in their task of being a science, restricted to nothing more than poetry. In terms of actually applying it, language appears, in his opinion at least, to be the perfect candidate. As he says,
Behind the textual process has been sought a phonetic system, a semantic system, a grammatical system.
However, Hjelmslev contends, all of these have, at least in his time, been surface level at best. Due largely to the humanist opposition to systems, no analysis has gone far enough to actually look at what makes language, well, a language. This takes us now to the next chapter, titled Linguistic Theory and Empiricism. This is quite short, and all that can really be said about it is that Hjelmslev's theory of language is focused on what he calls the empirical principle. Essentially,
the theory shall be free of contradiction, self-consistent, exhaustive, and as simple as possible.
He goes on to order these features based on importance. Self-consistency, or freedom from contradiction, takes precedence over exhaustive description, which in turn takes precedence over simplicity. Ending the chapter, Hjelmslev says that the term empirical principle isn't set in stone. It's simply a name that may or may not be fully accurate, and he says he will change it if it is found to be inappropriate. We now arrive at Chapter 4, Linguistic Theory and Induction. Here, his goal is to separate induction from the aforementioned empirical principle, the prior defined by him as the gradual ascent from something particular, or rather specific, to something general. Traditional linguistics, he says, starts off with things like individual sounds, which are then grouped together under phonemes, what he refers to as classes of sounds, that are then further collected into categories. This is an inductive approach, moving from small units to larger, more general ones. Hjelmslev's focus now is to outline induction's failings and limitations, beginning by stating,
it inevitably leads to the abstraction of concepts which are then hyperstatized as real. This realism, in the medieval sense, fails to yield a useful basis of comparison, since the concepts thus obtained are not general.
Essentially, what he means here is that linguistics creates artificial groupings that it then treats as real, even if such a thing isn't self-evident. As an example, take something like the genitive case or the subjunctive mood. In one language, say Latin, they mean something very different from their so-called equivalents in another, like Greek. It's thus that induction is unable to find constancy, and in fact violates the empirical principle. It is not free of contradiction, nor is it simple, he says. What we have to do now instead is use a deductive method, one where language is considered as a class that can be broken down into components, which are then in turn treated as classes which can be split up even further. Ending the chapter, he summarizes his argument by saying,
this procedure may therefore be defined briefly as a progression from class to component, not from component to class, as an analytic and specifying, not a synthetic and generalizing movement.
With the next chapter, titled Linguistics and Realism, he seeks to answer the question of whether the relationship between theory and its object is unidirectional or bidirectional. In other words, he asks, does the object determine and affect the theory, or does the theory determine and affect the object? If you watched the first series I did on this channel on Ferdinand de Saussure, this may be ringing some bells, as if this was a question he too sought to answer. Hjelmslev's attempt begins with trying to determine what exactly a theory is. He's very specific about not using it in the sense of a collection of hypotheses, which he says obviously requires that the object affect it and not vice versa. Instead, his use of the word theory has two factors, that of arbitrariness and that of appropriateness. Hjelmslev defines the prior as follows.
A theory, in our sense, is in itself independent of any experience. In itself, it says nothing at all about the possibility of its application and relation to empirical data.
Basically, what he means by this is that his notion of theory isn't tied down to anything other than the deductive system used to, in his words, compute the possibilities that follow from its premises. This ties in quite closely with theory's second aspect, appropriateness.
A theory introduces certain premises concerning which the theoretician knows from preceding experience that they fulfill the conditions for application to certain empirical data.
These premises are as general as possible, so that they are able to apply to a large amount of empirical data. To simplify a bit, theories to Hjelmslev exist outside of verification. Empirical data doesn't strengthen or weaken them necessarily, but rather only impacts their applicability. hypotheses can be built on a theory, which can be either supported or refuted, but the theory itself remains separate. Ending the chapter, linguistics can therefore be seen as consisting of a calculation based on a group of broad premises: appropriateness, predicting possibilities. However, it says nothing about the realization of those possibilities, arbitrariness, leaving that to hypotheses, which may or may not be accurate. This takes us to chapter 6, the Aim of Linguistic Theory. Hjelmslev starts off again by defining theory, this time a bit more concisely.
A theory, then in our sense of the word, may be said to aim at providing a procedural method by means of which objects of a premised nature can be described self-consistently and exhaustively.
He has the caveat that such a theory shouldn't aim only at explaining one singular object, but rather be general enough to comprehend all objects that are conceivable from a certain premise. The object of linguistics, he says, is texts, not only texts present and past, but all texts that could theoretically be produced. However, it doesn't suffice to simply describe and predict all possible texts of a given language. Instead, Hjelmslev states, linguistics must strive to be applicable to all languages, even those that haven't been realized or those that might never be realized in the first place. In order to achieve this, linguists have to try and find the most general objects that appear in all languages, working deductively from there. In the process, it's very possible that multiple different methods of going about the same thing will appear. This is where Hjelmslev's third principle, derived from the first, comes into play, the simplicity principle. According to it, the correct method is the one that yields the most simple description. If multiple methods are able to achieve the same level of description, then the one with the simplest procedure is selected. This is quite important, since, in his words,
it is by reference to this principle, and only by reference to it, that we can attach any meaning to an assertion that one self-consistent and exhaustive solution is correct, and another incorrect.
With this, we get to chapter 7, titled Perspectives of Linguistic Theory. At this point, Hjelmslev says, we can begin to circumscribe the scope of linguistics' object of study. However, this is only a temporary measure, and instead of limiting our field of view, should simply serve to divide up the difficulties that linguists face. This circumscription is justified, in his words, only if it later allows us to broaden it self-consistently and exhaustively to surrounding phenomena. That is to say,
if, after analysis, the global totality, language in life and actuality, may be viewed synthetically as a whole, as organized around a leading principle.
Ending the section, he says our point of departure ought to be what is considered so-called natural language. From this first frame, linguistic theory can be extended and extended, until it fully contains all the totality of human speech. Here, we arrive at the last, fairly short chapter we'll be looking at today, the system of definitions. His focus with this is to explain that linguistics must strive to be as unmetaphysical as possible. In other words, it must try its best to avoid implicit premises. Instead, as the title suggests, it's important that every permanent definition is interconnected with other such concepts. Along with these so-called formal definitions, Hjelmslev also suggests that it's important to have some operative ones, those which are only temporary. These can be definitions that later become formal, finding a place in the system, or those that eventually become redundant or unnecessary. Now, this concludes the first 8 chapters from Louis Hjelmslev's book, Prolegomena to a Theory of Language. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll look at the next few chapters, defining some of the key concepts that underlie his understanding of linguistics. Until then, bye!